This is lecture 55B on the chiefdom transition in China. And I want to start with a brief review of causality and process in the formation of Paleolithic Homo sapiens. Keep it brief. In the last lecture you'll remember that I mentioned the Zhuchang skulls that were excavated in 2007 and 2014, and mentioned that the reactionary view of the anti-communist well-known bigot Rupert Murdoch and those he sponsors have been propagandizing for a very recent African origin for Homo sapiens. And since Murdoch bought National Geographic magazine, he's turned it into a propaganda organ to kind of develop this false flag de facto anti-science thesis. Now, that view was never acceptable because it would require ignoring all of the world's archaeological evidence that proves the evolution of Homo through the preceding Australopithecine and then Erectus stages prior to becoming fully sapiens by 1 million years ago. And these are the three grades or stages of Homo's physical evolution. And we base these on cubic centimeter cranial capacity because brain size is the only scientifically acceptable basis for determining human species categories. And why is that true? Well, it's Homo sociocultural evolution that natural selection is acting to behoove. Cranial capacity reflects humanity's ability to survive through culture. Culture gives humanity its irreversible, unchallengeable survival superiority. Culture is the way humans interact with their environment. And culture is defined anthropologically, as you know by now, as the forces of production determining what relations of production are possible. And taken together, these two are called the mode of production. They form the basis society, upon which a superstructure of worldview arises in all cases. Now, in other words, in anthropological science, culture is the mode of production of technology and social organization upon which ideology arises as a superstructure. Now, I want to do a real quick review of the archaeological evidence for the advanced Paleolithic broad-spectrum hunting-gathering chiefdom precursor sites. And we'll start with Choukoutian, which is right outside of Beijing. And I've got a map over here so you can take a look at where these sites are located. And I've put green pins in the map so that we'll differentiate those from the agricultural complex sites that we're going to talk about in the latter part of this lecture. Oh, are we on? I picked 10 sites which I thought were the most important for you to have a rough idea of where they are geographically within China. The first one is the most famous one, Choukoutian, nowadays spelled and pronounced Zhoukoutian, which is about 30 miles southwest of Beijing. The second one is the Luonan Basin sites, which is right here. Then thirdly, we have the Jinggongshan Basin sites, and they are right here, near Wuhan. For those of you familiar with Chinese geography, you'll know that site pretty well. And then fourthly, we have near the city of Dali, D-A-L-I, a group of sites right there. These are all sites which date in the last 40,000 years, so they are direct precursors to the broad spectrum and agricultural revolution. Then we have the Jinggishan Cave in Liaoning province, which is over here. I can see in my own where I put it, right there. Famous province, but at any rate. And then we have the Dingkun site, which is marked right there. That's kind of pretty close to Beijing, as you can see. Then we have the Miaoho Shan Cave site near the city of Benji in the Liaoning province. That's I marked it as number 7 up here. And then Jiao in the Niwan Basin of Hebei province, which is number 8 of our 10 in this particular list, and is right there. And finally, we have in Henan province the Lingjing site, which is number 9, and that is, where did I put it? Liaoning is right up here, so it's got to be right in here. Oh, here it is. It looks like a 4 for me. Okay, and then 10, we have the Guanyindang cave site in Guizhou province of China, which is down here on number 10, right there, right in the middle of that province. Now, these green pins, as you can probably see, extend right across almost all of what we call nuclear China. What is nuclear China exactly? Well, this river, the Wangho or Yellow River over here in the north, and the Yangtze River down here in the south, are the centerpiece of the richest agricultural land in the world. And it's here that the agricultural revolution is going to take place in China, and which will make China the center of the world as far as Marxist archaeology is concerned. As far as in Europe, of course, at this time, these guys are still in England. They're still back there with spears and bows and arrows and so on, behaving pretty much like hunters and gatherers. At any rate, we're going to stop there for now with regard to the map. I'm going to go back to the text. Now, well, there's a lot of detail in the chapter, so when you get your book, you'll be able to see specifically which artifacts are there and why we think they're important. And when I say we, I mean me and the new cadre of Chinese archaeologists which have come up in recent years. Which takes us to the next topic I want to mention real quickly, which is called the Xia Zhang Zhou Chronology Project. That's XIA for Xia, SHANG for Shang, and Zhou is ZHOU, or ZHOU if you're Canadian. Now, the Communist Party of China Politburo ordered that the Xia Shang Zhou Chronology Project be commissioned by the People's Republic in 1996, and so it was part of the 9th five-year plan. It was to be an interdisciplinary study to determine with accuracy the location and time frame of the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, and Tsinghua University professor Li Shouquin was chosen to be the director. Now, about 200 specialists took part in the project during the course of its several years, and they correlated radiocarbon dates, archaeological dating methods, historical textual analysis, astronomical records, and other methods to achieve greater temporal and geographic accuracy. And the project was undertaken by Chinese archaeologists in association with international experts. So the Xia Shang Zhou Chronology Project was an interdisciplinary project that would have made Scottish McNeish and Jane Libby proud. And it was part of the 9th five-year plan. Its purpose, as I say, was to determine with accuracy the location and time frame of these cities and the cultural area that they occupied. And the 9th plan itself extended from 1996 to 2000, and it was the 5th plenary session of the 14th Communist Party of China Central Committee that adopted the proposal on the 9th five-year plan of the national economy and social development and long-range objectives to the year 2010 on September 28, 1995, and it was the Political Bureau specifically which ordered that this archaeological historical study be undertaken and resolved, that is, all of the various questions about whether the Xia dynasty existed and so on and so forth, which I'm not going to bother with here because there's no point in reviewing that. It would be kind of like if Karl Marx had started Capital Volume 1 the way he had intended to, with a long history of the theories of surplus value, an idea he junked as soon as U.S. Civil War started, in favor of the way it does start with the commodity. And what I'm going to do is I have reworked all of the dates so that they are BP. We got rid of all this BC AD business, which is irrelevant in China anyway, and follow the results which have now become part of every textbook in China. So you're following the most modern interpretation of Chinese prehistory and history and of the socio-cultural evolution there too. Now, to get to the Xia Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom, all of the archaeology leading to it had to be assembled, and we shall now continue with our review here. And later I'm going to take a look at the map and we'll hit some of the spots. I can show you that we are going to be talking about right now. And of course, when you get your book, which will be next year, next January, you will be able to look at all of this in some detail. But for now, this is the way we're going to handle it. So we're looking at first the advanced Paleolithic from those green sites, or green pinned sites, which I just showed you, evolved into a broad spectrum revolution, which in turn evolved into an agricultural revolution. These are the archaeological periods known as Advanced Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. And the analysis of stone tools by Professors Liu Li and Richard S. McNeish and Associates shows that the origins of Chinese agriculture lie in the pre-agricultural Paleolithic and Mesolithic. It was during these times that hunter-gatherers harvested wild plants for food and used stone tools. In the Neolithic, these tools would be used to harvest millet and rice. Now, people first exploited a broad spectrum of wild animal and plant resources in what Professor Conrad Kotak has named the broad spectrum revolution, and it was the necessary prelude to agricultural revolution in China, as well as everywhere else in the world where agriculture is autochthonous, that is, originating, its origin. Now, the anchor sequence for the agricultural revolution in China is that of Richard S. McNeish and Jane Libby. McNeish and Libby are the editors of the 1995 publication Origin of Rice Agriculture from the Andover Foundation for Archaeology, which is just as a matter of interest. George H.W. Bush, when he was on the board of directors of Peabody, of the Andover Phillips Academy, stole all of the money out of the Peabody Foundation research funds and used it for whatever purposes they wanted to use it for. And as a consequence, the Scotty McNeish left and set up his own foundation, which is where this Andover Foundation comes from. He's deceased now, and of course, so his work is being carried on by some of his followers. And I just mentioned that as an aside. Now, the anchor sequence specifically revolves around the Xirandong and Diatonghan sites. Now, these are located in the Dayuan Basin of southwest Jiangxi Province in southern China. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. These are in red pins on the map. Morphological studies of rice phytoliths from the Diaotong 1 archaeological site clearly show the transition from the collection of wild rice to the cultivation of domesticated rice. The large number of wild rice phytoliths at the Diaotong 1 level, dating from 12,000 to 11,000 BP, indicate that while wild rice collection was part of the local means of subsistence, and changes in the morphology of thousands of Diaotong 1 phytoliths dating from 16,000 to 10,000 years ago show that rice was being simultaneously domesticated. In other words, they were still collecting wild rice and they were still planting and domesticating through selection rice plants. So the process was going on pretty much as it should have been. Again, Jane Libby and Richard McNeish, my old mentor, have written the classic paper on this, on the origins of rice agriculture, which is published by their foundation, this Andover Foundation for Archaeological Research. And you can get it online, you can get it in your libraries, but it's important for those of you that are interested in China and in the agricultural revolution there. So, now, they show what we see is a progressive domestication of rice, and of course there will be a decreasing amount of wild rice being collected, an increasing amount of reliance on domesticated rice, and that's pretty much what we see. And this entire process occurs between 13,500 to 8,200 years ago. The process of domesticating the three rice forms of Indica, Japonica, and Rufipogan, or Ricin, O-R-Y-Z-A is the genus name. Now, the Neolithic age in China begins by 16,000 BP. Early evidence for Proto-Chinese millet agriculture is radiocarbon dated to about 9,000 BP, and the early evidence of cultivated rice found by the Jiangxi River, as we have seen, extends from between 16 and 8,000 years ago. Now, farming gave rise to the Jiahu culture between 9,000 and 7,800 BP. At Daimidi in Ningxia, there are 3,172 cliff carvings dating between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, and these feature 8,453 individual characters, such as the sun, moon, stars, gods, and scenes of hunting or grazing. They are pictographs, and they're similar to the earliest character of written Chinese. So Chinese proto-writing existed in Jiao around 9,000 years ago, Dadiwan from 7,800 BP to 7,400 BP, Damaidi from 8,000 BP, and in Banpo City from 7,000 BP. And some scholars believe that the Jiahu symbols were the earliest Chinese writing system. So, this project, once it got underway, did not only deal with the origins of rice and millet agriculture, but and other forms such as wheat, oats, rye, but also it resolved the problem of the origins of the Chinese language, or written language. Now, in 2011, a combined effort by the Stanford University, New York University, Washington University, and St. Louis, and Purdue University provided evidence for one single origin of domesticated rice in the Yangtze Valley of China. And we'll take a look at that on the map pretty soon. Then in 2012, a map of rice genome variation was published indicating that a domestication of rice also occurred in the Pearl River Valley region. Now, what this proves, and what you're going to see when you take a look at the spread of the early agricultural villages of China, is that rice was originally domesticated over a very broad region that includes the Pearl River, that's the river that goes up from Hong Kong to what we used to call Canton, and Yangtze River valleys in China. The precise dates of this original domestication are estimated to begin no later than 16,000 years ago, but it's a process that was probably going on for thousands of years before that, in the sense that these the wild predecessor plants were being collected, and it's only a hop, skip, and a jump from collecting them to noticing that they can be placed in such a way as to be replanted or cultivated, and from cultivation, true domestication is just one more step. At any rate, this is consistent with known archaeological data on the subject, and from China, rice spread to South and Southeast Asia. From rice spread to the Middle East, where we have the sativa form of oryza from a grave in Iran from the 1st century AD. In 2006, based on one chloroplast and two nuclear gene regions, Londo and associates had proposed that the Oryza sativa rice was domesticated at least twice, and indica in eastern India, Myanmar, and Thailand. And they concluded that Japonica, or Japonica, had been domesticated in China and Vietnam, though conceding that there was archaeological and genetic evidence for a single original domestication of rice in the lowlands of nuclear China. But the point I want to bring across to you in these lectures is that this entire area of nuclear China, going down into Indochina, was an area where farming families were, for thousands of years, collecting not just wild plants, but also domesticating plants, cultivating them, and eventually irrigating them. Now, we'll take a look at millet's wild ancestors, which were barnyard grass and panic grass, and they gave rise to a group of highly variable small-seeded grasses. In Asia, they are becoming widely grown at this time, that is, after 10,000 years ago. The grains for fodder and human food. Millets have been cultivated in East Asia for over 10,000 years now. There were other centers of domestication, just as interesting to note, in Southwest Asia, by which we mean the hilly flanks of Mesopotamia, and Africa. And now this may be new to some of you, but there's a broad domestication zone in Africa that extends from Ethiopia all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's pretty much unknown. We're just beginning to get archaeology there. But there are cities there in Black Africa that are, only one of which I know about is in Ethiopia that's been excavated, but it's like every other early city, and in the sense that it's huge. It was originally an advanced theocratic chiefdom. It became an early kingdom. Now, you know, this territory is very much like Yucatan. If you leave anything untended for more than a few months or years, it's going to be overgrown. So it's going to take a lot of research to cut through the jungle and get into all of this, but it's there. So we have another domestication center for millet over there in that Africa, that black African area. Now, millet crops are favored due to their productivity and short growing season under dry, high temperature conditions. The most widely grown millet is called pearl millet. Then we have finger millet, proto millet, and foxtail millet as the next most important crop species, and they are small-grained, annual, warm weather cereals belonging to grass family, of course. They are highly tolerant of extreme weather conditions such as drought and are as nutritious as rice and wheat. They contain low phytic acid and are rich in dietary fiber, iron, calcium, and B vitamins, and these millets release sugar slowly in the human bloodstream and therefore diminish glucose absorption. Consumption of the minor millets in the diets of Chinese people have been going on since the beginning of the Chinese chiefdom stages. Now, foxtail millet was the first domesticated millet in China. Then in India, the Yajurveda texts identify foxtail millet, which is called Priangava, barnyard, that's the species name, barnyard millet, which is called Enava, and black finger millet, Shiamaka, as commonly consumed in South Asia, that is in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, by 6,500 BP years ago. Then we come to the town of Xishan, C-I-S-H-A-N. I marked it as item number 11 with a red pin on the map. Xishan archaeology. The archaeological recovery of charred grains found in northern China archaeological sites shows the cultivation of millets in northern China and adjacent Korea was equally important to early rice. Millets were an important part of the prehistoric diet in, as we have seen, early Chinese Neolithic, beginning with broomcorn millet, that is Panicum miliaceum, and foxtail millet. In 2009, Professor Liu and associates published the earliest evidence of millet cultivation in China at 10,700 BP near the city of Xishan, C-I-S-H-A-N. These Xishan dates for common millet husk phytoliths and biomolecular components were identified and dated from 10,300 to 8,700 BP, and they were excavated in storage pits of pit houses in association with pottery and stone tools related to millet cultivation. So then I give the citing for Professor Liu and associates and their publications. Evidence from Xishan for foxtail millet dates back to around 10,500 BP and is joined by, later on, a well-preserved bowl containing well-preserved noodles from foxtail millet and broomcorn millet in the Lajia archaeological site in China. Paleoethnobotanists have evidence of the spread of the cultivation of millet in the Korean peninsula dating to the Middle Julmun pottery period around 3500 to 2000 BC. We will be getting to Korea once we finished with the Chinese series. In Korea, millet continued as an important element in an intensive multi-cropping agriculture of the Mumun pottery period from about 3,500 to 2,300 years ago. Millets and their wild ancestors, such as barnyard grass and panic grass, were also cultivated in Japan during the Jomon period, sometime after 8,000 BP. Now, Asian varieties of millet made their way from China to the Black Sea region of Europe by 7,000 years ago. The cultivation of common millet as the earliest dry crop in East Asia was due to its drought resistance that helped it spread. Current research on millets is conducted at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in Telangana, India, and by the USDA ARS at Tifton, Georgia, USA. Remains of domesticated millet have been found in northern China at Jinglonggu, Yuzhang, Dadiwan, Xishan, and several Palegang sites, all of which I've shown with red pins on the map. The amount of domesticated millet eaten at these sites was proportionally quite low compared to other plants. At Zilonggu, millet made up only 15% of all plant remains compared to other plants. It runs between the years 8,200 to 7,400 BP. The ratio changed to 99% by 1550 BP. So you can see that that became an increasingly important part of the human diet and for feeding animals. Experiments have shown that millet requires very little human intervention to grow, so it's a crop that a peasant can grow that doesn't have to rely on irrigation. Now, millet in the autochthonous African plant domestication zone is best known in the Sahel region of West Africa, that is Sahel, and there is early evidence of an autochthonous plant domestication region there, as I just mentioned, where the cultivation of pearl millet in Mali dates to 4,500 BP, and is part of that zone. And the pearl millet had spread from the Sahel to South Asia by 4,300 BP. That is, by South Asia, we're talking about Mesopotamia, or about India. Now, more on rice domestication follows in this particular chapter. I don't think I'm going to go over too much more of it here, except to say that at near the city of Xi'an, Xian, marked as number 13 on the red pin on the map, you're going to see sites of what's called the Hemudu culture that existed between 7,500 and 5,300 BP in Yuyao and Bampao, which are near Xi'an, and include millet and spade-like tools made of stone and millet. And evidence of settled rice agriculture has been found there at the Hemudu site of Tian Lu Shan. I marked that with a red pin, and that it says 7,000 to 6,500 years ago, with rice becoming the backbone of the agricultural economy by the advent of the Majia Bang culture in southern China. And then I give all of the references, which includes an important one by Professor Liu and Chen, called The Archaeology of China from Late Paleolithic to the Early Bronze Age, the Emergence of Social Inequality in the Middle Neolithic, 5,000 to 3,000 BC. Now, that's the name of their article. So there is also a long tradition involving agriculture in Chinese mythology, which I'm not going to go over here. There have been plenty of debates on the origin of domesticated rice, and I'm not going to go over all of that because I don't think you're that interested in the history of the debate. But what we do know is that both Indica and Japonica spring from a single domestication that occurred 13,500 to 8,200 years ago in China of the wild rice Oryza rufipogan. And then I give the proceedings of that in an article by a group of authors called Molecular Evidence for a Single Evolutionary Origin of Domesticated Rice in the Proceedings of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And then we have item number 14 on the Pearl River sites. This is the river that goes from Hong Kong up to Old Canton, or Guangzhou today. And a 2012 study entitled, quote, "A Map of Rice Genome Variation Reveals the Origin of Cultivated Rice," was published in Nature at volume 490. It has a map of rice genome variation indicating that the domestication of rice occurred in the Pearl River Valley region of China. And the authors show that East Asian rice then spread to South and Southeast Asia. The accepted view, based on archaeological evidence, is that rice was first domesticated in the region of the Yangtze River Valley as well. So an article on that was done by Professor Vaughn and associates called "The Evolving Story of Rice Evolution," published in Plant Science in 1996. And in an article he calls "The Origins and Spread of Agriculture and Pastoralism in Eurasia." And then, of course, we have the classic article of McNeish and Libby on the origins of rice agriculture, published as early as 1995 by the Andover Foundation for Archaeology. Now, finally, more on the Xian Rendong and Diatongwan sites. As we've seen, morphological studies of rice phytoliths from the Diatongwan archaeological site clearly show the transition from the collection of wild rice to the cultivation of domesticated rice. And the large number of wild rice phytoliths at the Diatongwan level date from 12,000 to 11,000 BP, and they indicate that wild rice collection was part of the local means of subsistence, and changes in their morphology in thousands of instances occurred between 16,000 and 10,000 BP that can only be accounted for by experimentation, human experimentation in their domestication. And then I give all of the proper important references there. At any rate, joint excavations in 1993 and 1995 by Richard S. McNeish and his Andover Foundation for Archaeological Research of FAR and the Department of Archaeology of Peking University yielded early Neolithic artifacts that were in association with thousands of phytoliths, as we have seen, that show this progressive domestication of rice beginning at least as early as 16,000 BP, continuing through 10,000 BP. And the full reports are also available not only by McNeish and Libby, but by Zhang Qi and his associates in the Department of Archaeology at Peking University in Beijing. And I give the email for those of you that might want to get in contact with these archaeologists for whatever reason. And we know that all of the genetic evidence shows that all forms of Asian rice, including Indica and Japonica, sprang from this single domestication of wild Oryza rufipogon that started by 13,500 years ago, and they were brought into existence by 8,200 years ago. Now, just one more comment. In 2011, a combined effort by Stanford University, New York University, Washington University in St. Louis, and Purdue University professors has provided evidence for one single origin domesticated rice in the Yangtze Valley of China. And then I give all of those references. But the important thing here is that this very broad area of Neolithic agricultural revolution that you're going to see, that covered all of nuclear China. The fact that where we have these very early dates here and there within that region simply is an interesting point, an anchor point for a much broader region where all of this was occurring. What we're looking at when we have these pins in the map is where there have been archaeological sites excavated, mostly now, of course, by Chinese archaeologists, and most of that within the last 30 years. One could assume that if this rate continues, you're going to have a map that's covered with red pins another 30 years from now, because this is an area that covers all of nuclear China. That is the area from the Wangho all the way to the South China Sea, all the way to the East China Sea, and over a period of time involved tens and then hundreds of millions of people. So, rice spread to the Middle East, as we've seen. We don't have to go over that again. Now, one of the key things we're looking for here is the selection by humans for non-shattering. The functional allele for non-shattering in a rice grain or a millet grain being the critical indicator of domestication in grains overall, as well as 5 other single nucleotide polymorphisms, is identical in both Indica and Japonica. Therefore, in 2008, Professor Vaughan et al. Determined a single domestication event for Oryza sativa happened in the region of the Yangtze River Valley. Once one of these events would occur, and there was enough wild seed that it could move beyond the specific family village, then it would, and probably became a trade item that would be highly desired. Because one of the things, if you're growing rice, you're a rice farmer, you want your rice not to shatter on the stem while it's out in the field. These are things that a farmer would be talking about all the time. Those of you that are familiar with farming states and cities in the USA today know that that's the kind of stuff that farmers talk about when they go to the Grange meeting or whatever it is. Now, rice appears to have been used by all the early Neolithic populations as cited above in the work of McNeish and Zhang, and now at the towns of Lijiakun and Yongchenyan, which I marked as red pin number 15 on the map. Evidence of rice cultivation reliance in China occurs by 11,500 BP from experimentation in domestication that began by 16,000 BP, and this is certain. Now, morphological studies of these phytoliths, as we have seen, and those specifically from the Diao Tongwan archaeological site, clearly show the transition from the collection of wild rice to the cultivation of domesticated rice in that 8,000-year period. And while the large number of wild rice phytoliths of the Diaotongwan level date from zones between 12 and 11,000 BP, they indicate that wild rice collection was still part of the local means of subsistence. These changes in the morphology of the Diaotongwan phytoliths date from 10,000 to 8,000 BP and show that rice had by this time in that 2 millennia period been fully domesticated. An analysis of Chinese rice residues from Pengtoshan, which are carbon dated between 8,200 and 7,800 BC, proved that rice had been domesticated by this time, and the conclusion must be simply that domestication began while wild resource precursor grass was being collected, nor is that going to be very surprising. Red pin number 16 is the Yangshao culture, which is a Neolithic culture that is an agricultural village culture that existed extensively along the Yellow River in China. This is the tribal agricultural stage. It is dated from around 7,000 BP to 5,000 BP. The Yangshao type site, the type archaeological site, is in Henan province, and it was the first excavated representative village of this culture, discovered in 1921 by the Swedish archaeologist Johan Gunnar Andersson, who died in 1960. The Yangshao culture began in Henan, Shanxi, and Shaanxi. The main food of the Yangshao people was millet. Some Yangshao sites show a preference for foxtail millet, others broomcorn millet. Rice was also cultivated. Included are the Pelegang sites that run between 9,000 and 7,000 BP in the middle Yellow River region of North China. A phytolith analysis of samples from Tanghu archaeological site in the middle Yellow River region of China shows that the dry farmed broomcorn millet as well as rice cultivation took place from 7,800 to 4,500 years ago. In short, Professor Zhang and associates have evidence of millet and rice mixed farming there by 7,800 BP. By there I mean the middle Yellow River region. And they wrote an article called Early Mixed Farming of Millet and Rice 7,800 Years Ago in the Middle Yellow River region of China. Now the rice requires water under irrigation, but millet does not. So they had taken advantage of both strategies. And then I give the references and Professor Zhang's email in case anybody wants to contact him. In 1986, Chang Guangqi reported in the Archaeology of Ancient China that this early tribal agricultural stage had the Yangshao people commonly eating pigs and dogs, as well as sheep, goats, and cattle, and that were just beginning to be domesticated. And Professor Chang also points out that much of their meat came from hunting and fishing, and that the middle Yangshao settlements such as Jiangxi contained raised floor buildings used for the storage of surplus grains. Polished specialized grinding stones for making flour were found, and the overall context leads me to conclude that these people had not yet made the transition from the early tribal agricultural stage to the simple chiefdom stage. However, they were definitely sending surplus social product to the tribal council for storage and eventual redistribution as needed. So what was the causal trigger for simple chiefdom formation in this vast area? The Yangshao people had an early form of silkworm cultivation, and that could have been the productive trigger for its next upward move. The simple chiefdom stage has a centralized, efficient administration that could accomplish this emergent invention and professional specialization. That is, professional specialization would have eventually accompanied silkworm cultivation, even if it began as a household activity. And it's precisely that kind of thing that we're looking at when we want to see why would somebody move beyond tribal agriculture and a tribal council to a simple chiefdom. Now, we've discussed the theoretical aspects of this throughout this series of lectures and throughout the textbooks, so I'm not going to revisit that now. But when we're looking for a causal trigger, in the case of China, it may have been silkworm cultivation that began in the peasant households of tribal villagers such as the Yangshao, and eventually was professionally specialized. Now, the next Neolithic stage is that of the archaeologically well-known Longshan culture, which I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. Longshan is definitely a stage of simple chiefdoms where silkworms were cultivated. Archaeologically, it is easily identified by distinctive pottery made by wheel, and wheel pottery in and of itself is almost always an indication of professional specialization. So the Yangshao culture created pottery, and the Yangshao artisans made fine white, red, and black painted pottery with human, facial, animal, and geometric designs. Unlike the later Longshan culture, the Yangshao culture features handmade, household domestic pottery production rather than the use of pottery wheels in ceramic work. That means that the Longshan are undoubtedly going to be part of a simple chiefdom. These people made pottery vessels, and there is excavated evidence for such painted vessels have been used to bury children. So this makes me think that pottery was highly valued by these villagers. As we've seen, the Yangshao culture produced silk from silkworms and wove hemp. Men wore loincloths and tied their hair in a topknot. The house dress and hairstyling for women was invented. Women adopted the idea of the dress when they wrapped a length of cloth around themselves, and they also began to tie their hair in a bun. This seems to me to indicate that women were taking a leading role in their own social liberation. Now, as for the houses, these were built by digging a rounded rectangular pit a few feet deep. Then they were rammed, and a lattice of wattle was woven over it. Then it was plastered with mud, and next a few short wattle poles would be placed around the top of the pit, and more wattle would be woven to it, and it was plastered with mud. And a framework of poles would be placed to make a cone shape for the roof. Now poles would be added to support the roof, and it was then thatched with millet stalks. The floor was also rammed down. There was a little furniture in these houses, and that almost always includes a stool around a shallow fireplace in the middle of the house. A bench along the wall is often found, and a bed along another wall made out of cloth. Food-filled vessels and utensils, and these vessels and utensils with the food were hung on the walls or placed on shelves that was built against a wall. And outside, a pen was built for animals. So this is what your basic tribal agricultural village looked like. And the village layout pattern for these Yangshao villages was somewhere between 10 to 14 acres, and houses were situated around a central square. And in terms of social structure, some experts' reports suggest a matriarchal culture, as do Professor Roy and Tisdale and others in an article called The Economic Development and Women in the World Community, published back in 1999. Now, some other specialists have argued that Yangshao society was in transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, and still others believe it was patriarchal. Now, these differences of opinion hinge on interpretations of burial practices and are reviewed in an article, book actually, called Gender and Chinese Archaeology by Catherine Lindiff and Yan Sun in 2004. Now, I want to just add this, that the role mentioned above of women asserting themselves with dresses and hairstyling leads me to think that matrifocality, regardless of descent and postmarital residence, should be the target of analysis. Matrifocality is a concept originally pioneered by George Mead, and now a retired professor, and the fellow with whom I wrote my very first academic article. Anyway, in 2001, Jiao Tianlong examines the role of women in gender studies in Chinese Neolithic archaeology, by Bettina Arnold and Nancy Wicker, in Gender and the Archaeology of Death by Altamira Press, and so I give the rest of the references. And then we go to the WEI, River Valley Archaeological Sites, where the type site is near Banpo Village which is near the city of Xi'an, that is Xian. It's one of the best-known ditch-enclosed settlements of the Yangshao culture. Another major settlement called Jiangzai was excavated out to its limits, and archaeologists found that it was also surrounded by a ringed ditch. Both Banpo and Jiangzai yielded incised marks on pottery, which are interpreted as numerals and precursors to true Chinese language, or script. Now, in 2012, Professors Liu and Chen published their exploration of the roles of agricultural development and advancing social complexity in the processes of state formation in China. See the archaeology of China from the late Paleolithic to the early Bronze Age in Cambridge World Archaeology. Now, Liu and Chen review 10,000 years of sociocultural evolution of Chinese society from the last Paleolithic hunting and gathering groups through Neolithic farming villages and on to the Shang dynasty after 3500 BP. And they fortunately had this resolution of all of the problems of terminology, area, and distribution which the party had ordered, and they began back in 1996. So, at any rate, they demonstrate that socio-political evolution was multicentric, shaped by inter-polity conflict, all of this while inventing technology and new forms of social organization, and they also accepted technologies introduced from other, that is, these people did, from other parts of East Asia, and presumably, therefore, were affected by their foreign forms of social organization. That is, at least they were aware of them, so that they knew that they're about forms of social organization which were similar to theirs and which were different from theirs. The book illustrates how ancient Chinese societies were transformed during this period from simple to complex, from tribal to urban, and from pre-literate to literate. And the Yangshao culture is divided into three phases. The early period, or Banpo phase, from 7,000 to 6,000 BP, represented by the Banpo, Jiangzai, Beishuling, and Dadiwan sites in the Hui River Valley in Shaanxi. The middle period, or Miadigou phase, 6,000 to 5,500 BP, saw an expansion of the culture in all directions. And most important to note is that this is the first indication of stratification into hierarchies that includes differing wealth of settlements in some areas, such as western Henan. In other words, this could be proof of movement from the tribal agricultural stage into the simple chiefdom stage. And finally, the Yangshao has the late period 5,500 to 5,000 BP, which witnessed a greater spread of settlement hierarchies. The first wall of rammed earth in China was built around the settlement of Zhejiang. That's 25 hectares in area in central Henan near the modern town of Zhangzhou. And then we have the Majiao culture, 5,300 to 4,000 BP, to the west, which is now considered a separate culture that developed from the middle Yangshao culture through the intermediate Xingling Xia phase. And then I list those, and that brings us up to the conclusion of this particular lecture. I want to take a quick look at the red pinned area to show you the general distribution. All right, so the red pins, if you can see that they're red, go from here to here to here to here to here to here. Now this is where McNeish and Libby did their classic study, the anchor sequence for the Neolithic and agricultural revolution in China. And the rest of these red pins show the distribution. And what you can see is, first of all, the green pin showed you the distribution of the advanced Paleolithic, and that was the basis upon which the broad spectrum revolution occurred, then the agricultural revolution, and that's the particular area. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the Longshan culture, which is definitely a simple chiefdom, which becomes an advanced theocratic chiefdom, and how these chiefdoms then evolved into kingships. And eventually we're going to get to the point where all of central nuclear China has 6 warring kingdoms. They're called the warring state period. And then we're going to talk about this mark up here, which is the Great Wall of China, which was built in sections. And you can see that it's a vast area that extends all the way from the ocean out here to the deserts. And about 3,000 miles, I think, in totality. I didn't try to link all of that because the map doesn't show all of that, and I mean, what it has is little X's here to show you where the wall is. And I just kind of put a red over that so you could see what's happening there. This wall was built by these primitive states as soon as they came into existence, these kingdoms, to prevent, and it was built in sections, to prevent the farmers from fleeing. It wasn't built to keep anybody from coming down from the south. It was built to keep these people in. And eventually it was extended until after the first emperor in 221 BC unified China, and he began the process of linking up all of these farms. And this was a complex period of social change under the first emperor, who came to power on a political program of feudalism, which meant giving the farmers a little more freedom in exchange for labor peace. But he knew that that in and of itself wasn't going to keep them from running away. So he wanted to complete these various walls so that families would be less likely to run away, and which had been the traditional thing. If you get really pissed off, you grab your family, and in the middle of the night you take off and head up to Mongolia. So, at any rate, we'll talk about that in the next lecture.